Hello and welcome everybody to this complementary skills session, in which we will learn something about climate change and climate actions and the role that laboratories can play in it. And today I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Fitzgerald, who will talk about lab greening, how you can play your part. But before we will properly introduce Dr. Fitzgerald, I want to take this opportunity to quickly introduce the IBEC Committee of Sustainable Research. This is just a very quick presentation talking about why the committee formed, who we are, what the problems are that we identified so far, actions that have been taken, but also actions that we want to implement to tackle this problem. So the first problem will not be new to any of you. As all of you know, labs are producing a lot of waste. A big percentage of it is plastic. And we're not talking about general waste, but about special waste, more hazardous, which needs more energy to be dealt with. And we're talking about incineration and such. So it is a lot of pollution going on with that kind of waste. Here you can see on the in the left graph, you can see the waste production at IBEC over the last 10 years, and especially the bio-waste, so stuff we use in cell culture, for example, has been increasing more than tenfold over the last 10 years, which is partly true because IBEC has been growing, but also because more labs are moving into the biomedical field of research. The actual problem here is that the people do not separate the waste properly. So not everything that is found in those sharp bins and biological bins actually belongs there. So we produce more than we actually have to. And that is a problem that can be tackled and should be solved. So actions that have been taken by IBEC so far is the tip of the month, which is not specific for climate actions, but every now and then talks about climate action. So it talks about minimization of waste, proper waste disposal, and also recycling of materials that can be recycled, such as tip boxes. Then another problem came from the introduction of the IBEC shopping net, which originally was introduced as a solution to yet another problem. So it made it easier for researchers to do purchases at any time and to have access to the entire list of products purchased by IBEC. So it was nice for labs that shopping was easier and more versatile, but disadvantages obviously were the number of purchases that were made, because people would not consolidate purchases anymore as they did before, because it was more tedious to do it. You could just purchase items separately, which drastically increased the number of purchases that were made. You see here the introduction of the IBEC net shop in 2015, and then we double in the amount of the number of purchases. So there is more transport and more packaging, and also more costs associated for the labs for the transport. So solving this problem would be nice, not only for the environment, but also for economic reasons. Again, tip of the month, sometimes just talking about this, just to consolidate purchases and for better planning to reduce the impact of that. Then in 2019, in September 2019, there was the first Catalan Summit for Actions Against Climate Change, in which the bid statement for global action to confront climate crisis was signed by IBEC, and in which it commits to promote a more sustainable practice in research and administration, and to contribute to fight climate change and pollution in our daily work. We celebrated the global strike action, in which participants could identify problems and offer solutions. So we have collected all of those proposals and are currently working with them. And then we formed this committee, the IBEC Committee for Sustainable Research, and we meet once a month and talk about problem identification and measures that we can implement to solve that problem to make IBEC a more green workspace. Here you have a screenshot of one of the first meetings we ever had, which is also a prime example why you should never take a picture from below. And this is us. We have now grown a little bit. In the end, you can see the all the names of the participants. Then talking about the actions, there will be an awareness campaign about the importance of more sustainable practices at the workplace in the lab, which is in collaboration with other business centers. And we will implement eco-reps, so people that are working in every lab, so just responsible in every lab, to make sure that the actions that we think of will also be implemented in the lab. So to have someone in the lab who is making sure that those will be implemented. If you're interested in being a eco-rep for your lab, contact us. In the end, Teresa's email will be, you will find Teresa's email. Other potential topics that will be covered is, I talked about already, the correct separation of hazardous waste, better planning of purchases to promote packaging and transport, energy saving. So we're talking about controllable AC or being able to turn on off the lights, which currently is not possible in one of our buildings. And not only the labs, but also the office space where you can reduce paper and toner consumption, for example, by electronic invoices. So this is us, the IBEX Sustainable Committee. Thanks. And again, if you're interested in joining or being an eco-rep for your lab, you can find Theresa's email and just contact us. All right, I hope that I stopped sharing the screen. All right, then now I'm going to introduce Dr. Una Fitzgerald. After completing a Bachelor's of Engineering and a Master's of Science in Biotechnology at the National University of Ireland, Galway, Dr. Fitzgerald worked in the pharmaceutical sector for 5 years in France and the UK, before embarking on a PhD in molecular biology at the University of Strathclyde, Glasgow. Following a brief spell in cancer research, on joining Professor Sue Barnett's lab in Glasgow University, she discovered her true passion, neuroscience, and in particular research on brain disorders, including multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease. Since returning to the University of Galway, Ireland, Dr. Fitzgerald has built a track record in multiple sclerosis research, is a funded investigator at Curum, the Science Foundation Ireland Research Centre on Medical Devices, and is the ex-director of the Galway Neuroscience Centre. She is the lead PI and coordinator of a 3.9 million EU-funded innovative training network, which is training 15 PhD students across Europe, with the aim of developing a novel device for treating the progressive phase of multiple sclerosis. In 2019, she led the Curum Lab to be the first in Europe to gain Green Lab certification for My Green Lab, and she now chairs the National Working Group on Sustainable Public Sector Labs. Dr. Fitzgerald's talk will be describing her journey from neuroscience research to climate activism. Dr. Fitzgerald, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Max, for that very nice introduction. And I really enjoyed your presentation and learning about everything that you're doing. So I'm looking forward to talking some more about that. And I'm really, really impressed with what you're doing. And I've got some questions as well for all of you. And I suppose we could save that for when I'm finished talking. So thank you to Christina and then after that, Clara, who were in touch with me in organising this presentation. I'm really, really delighted to be here. And what I'm going to do is, as Max explained, I'm going to talk about how I got to be speaking to you today. I'll go into a little bit of detail about the Green Lab certification program that we followed in 2019. And then the impact of that afterwards, once people started hearing about it. And then some recommendations for getting started. But I can see very clearly now that you actually have started already. So we can just discuss how we're both doing. And as Max mentioned, I'm a neuroscientist, work on multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's and the brain in general, and I'm involved in a number of programs that you can see here and that Max mentioned. But in case you haven't heard of Galway, it's on the west coast of Ireland here, and we have a very old university there, one of these nice ones with a quad and everything, and it's modelled on one of the universities in Oxford, and it was originally called Queen's College, but for obvious reasons that name is no longer there. And this is what the campus looks like actually in springtime, quite nice. And these are photographs that are taken by a colleague on campus. This is what it looks like in autumn. Sometimes we get clouds like this because we're also on the Atlantic. And this is actually the engineering building, although Curum is not based there. And I'll get back to that in a minute. I'll be explaining where Curum is. More pictures of Galway City. It's on the sea. This is a very old part of Galway. We have these very interesting boats called Galway hookers, and that's from the Irish hookery actually. So we have those boats out in the sea. We have seas like this, and there are people who swim in the sea every single day of the year. I'm not one of them. Another picture of Galway. So basically, it's a nice place. So do come to Galway to do your postgrads or your PhDs or whatever, or come and work in Galway. You'd be very, very welcome. But why am I here today? I mean, you, me, all of us, we do love doing research. but let's love our planet while we're doing it. Some of you might have seen this report that was published by Oxfam in 2017, and they reported that the richest 10% of the world's population have been responsible for 52% of cumulative carbon emissions. And I have a link there to that report. And I mean, one of the reasons that I'm showing it here today is just that it's a big problem. And how do we influence those 10% of the world's population who are having such a huge impact? So what can we do as individuals about this? And why are we doing? I think this audience already knows this. You know, if we here's the timeline. We're here at 2021 now, and this is our business as usual scenario in terms of global warming. I think actually this has been slightly revised down to 3.6, but various national plans will get us here. But this is where we really need to be, down at a 2 degrees of warming or less. But how can any of us do something about such an enormous problem? Well, I do believe that as a community of lab workers that we can actually make positive changes and to reduce the negative impact of our lab work on the environment, and that collectively we will have a big impact, I believe. And the people who have influenced me on this journey to you here today these are some of them, okay? There are now more, and this is kind of a growing list. I'm going to mention a couple of these in particular. But you might recognize some of the other names, and I'll be mentioning 1 or 2 of these. You're certainly going to recognize Greta of all of these. But the whole thing of greening even in Galway started literally in the summer of 2018, when I think I was in Glasgow and my daughter handed me this book. It was a small thing. I think I have it lying around here somewhere, but basically a little book that you would buy at a till, in a bookshop, and it was called No More Plastic, written by Martin Dorey, who is an author, kind of a chef. He's lived on beaches in England for half of his life. Anyway, I read that book and started to think about my own practices and plastic in general. But it did make me think about the climate a lot more. And I started reading a whole ton of books that I've listed, shown here in a pile, and then even more books lately. And this is Martin Dorey's second book, actually. No, it's actually a third one. He wrote another one for children. But in the meantime, the second one's about rubbish and things like that. This is another one. It's also quite good. So very, very interesting to get into all of that. But before we as a community of lab workers go any further, I think it is important to acknowledge that the COVID, that lab greening in general is much, much, much harder now during our COVID crisis. And there's an organization called Climate Outreach, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, that actually produced a report just after the crisis started, trying to help people to continue, if you like, with their greening efforts, and how to do that and how to have conversations with people when the whole world is obsessed with COVID, And I think that the environmental movement and climate activists have been finding that quite challenging. So I do recommend this website, by the way. I think it's really, really excellent. So plastic waste, as you know, is so much worse now. I mean, it was bad enough before COVID. It's just got so much worse. And this organization called Oceans Asia, from the very beginning, had been tracking what was happening because of COVID, and picking up all of these masks, and the gloves, and they're washing up all over the place, and it's pretty awful. So we have to find a way of dealing with that also. Presumably things will calm down once we all have our vaccine. Some of you may also have, if you do access UK channels, I'm not really sure, but Channel 4 from the UK had aired a program during the summer about a factory called Top Glove, which is in Malaysia. And they revealed the shocking exploitation of migrant workers who were making personal protective equipment to supply the NHS at that time. But in fact, if you look at Top Glove, or you watch this program, they are supplying 2/3 of the world's gloves. So I'm pretty confident that we will have gloves made from this factory in our labs and in your labs, And when you start thinking about that, you say, well, what's happening with all of our equipment? How is it being made? where does our labware come from? Under what working conditions are our labware or our lab items being made? I don't know. You all know about the fair trade label. Is there a fair trade for lab items? No, not yet. So maybe this is the kind of question that we have to ask, not only about our use of lab items and our practices and how they impact the lab, but how are these things being made? So these are important questions, I think. And how do you feel about the plastic waste that you generate in the lab? I don't think I need to ask you that because you've already explained it to me. You showed me pictures, which I recognize very, very well. So when I was thinking about plastic at the very beginning after reading that book, you know, and I was looking into what was going on in Ireland in general, and this used to be a bigger figure, so we are trending downwards. But when I looked up this figure for Ireland, at the moment, this is the figure generated, so 25 kilograms of plastic waste per year by an average Irish person. Here's another picture of Galway on the left. An average person in the US makes a lot more of that. Now maybe that needs to be updated as well, but that's the figure I found. A bench scientist has been estimated by a study done in the University of Exeter to produce on average 1,000 kilos of plastic waste per year. So so you know, you might think about what you're doing at home, but let's think about what we're doing in the lab. And this is the paper that has been quoted by anybody who is actually working to try and reduce their plastics in labs. It's just a short thing. It was a short letter to Nature at that time in 2015, but it's been quoted all around the labs now. If you go to any presentations, a lot of people are quoting this. In other words, there isn't a lot of publication. Sorry, there aren't a lot of publications out there that are properly reporting on the plastic within labs. But looking at the broader picture in Europe, and I found some data here that's interesting, and we can see that in Spain, the green bar here gives you the kilograms per head of population of plastic waste that's generated, and there's the value in tons, the actual amount. But look, Ireland is the worst in Europe, so we have, you know, we don't like being top of the league table for this sort of thing. It's pretty bad. All right. So let's get back to the lab question and take a look at what's going on. Now, I've called this plastic creep, and that's because when I was your age, I was working in a lab in Glasgow, and even, yeah, I was in Glasgow for my PhD and then working with Sue Barnett, and we were using glassware, you know, and I think the research was absolutely fine. But this creep has kind of happened over the last 30 years, as you know, and you've shown very, very similar pictures. So in the Quorum Lab one day, I think it was January last year, so just over a year ago, I personally went around the lab myself with a bag, a couple of bags, and picked out one plastic item from, you know, just went through all the drawers in the cupboards and picked out one example of everything that we were using. And it filled up these bags. But that's only one of those, and we're not using just one at a time, are we? You know? You have very, very similar cupboards. These are our lockers with the plastic just spilling out of them. You'll recognize these images. Here's an example of those items in their plastic wrapping, unwrapped, and here's all that pile of plastic packaging waste. Here's some more cell culture items, your multi-well plates, the serological pipettes, containers in the wrapping, unwrapped, and then all of that waste. Our medium bottles, you know, your DMAM, your HPSS, tip boxes, the cell culture flasks with all of that beautiful clean wrapping on it. And then your various items, look, you'll recognize these 50ml tubes, the 15ml, the Petri dishes, some reusable plastics, your Eppendorfs, and all of that sort of thing. And it's so like the image that you just showed, Max, before the start of this. Our pipette boxes, they're spilling out of the place. We do reuse them to an extent. It's very hard, you know, and we don't know what to do with these. We 2.5 litre bottles for ethanol. I mean, it's so clean. It's just a shame that it's being basically incinerated in Ireland. We're trying to change this, but our safety committees are pushing back on it, which is annoying. And of course, the gloves. I mean, you know, it's just awful. So we need to find a better solution for this. And in fact, we are working on a circular solution, semi-circular solution to this at the moment. And we got some funding from Science Foundation Ireland recently for a plastics challenge. And we're currently engaging in a survey of plastic usage across the whole of Ireland. And I can tell you about that after the talk, or at the Q&A time. So, you know, that whole experience of me reading that book and then going into the lab and paying attention to what was going on, you know, obviously you start to ask questions not just about plastic. You know, you start saying, well, what's going on here? How are we impacting the environment, and what can we do about it? So to give you a clear picture of our location, this is our university campus. Here's the nice old quad here. And then this is our kind of marine research part here. We've got the River Corrib running alongside the campus. Here's the engineering building I showed you earlier. And this is the Biomedical Sciences Research Building where Cuaram is housed. I have to say, you know, I'm kind of concerned. I love this River Corrib that's in Galway. It's a huge feature of Galway. But I'm wondering if I should tell the president, who sits over here in the quad, that, you know, the sea level rises, the sea levels are going to rise and this campus is going to be flooded, you know, if we don't do something. Anyhow, we're based here in the Cuaram Lab on the first floor of this research dedicated building. There are about 350 people in the building, and within the Cuaram Lab, there's capacity for 60. At the moment, we are restricted to 20 people at any one time. And there are restrictions within the rooms, within the building as well, the number of people you can have in the small rooms and things like that. So we're working at much reduced capacity, as I'm sure you are as well. This is the green team that I have to acknowledge up front. We got a bit of funding from an Explore an innovation scheme, like €1,000 at the start of this, and that helped with printing posters and things like that, and getting some bins for sorting. And then top row here, the rest of them are PhD students. Like Enrico's in my lab, and he's actually since graduated, he's postdoc now. And Jim McMahon is a senior researcher in my lab. And then 2 technicians, experimental officers, the graphic artist, who's been really important as well. And then James, another PhD student. And then here, Patrick Lawless, who is runs, Apleona is a facilities management company. So he's the guy who knew all the questions about water and things like that, and the air vac systems. And so he's been a very important person in this green team as well. Now, I did look at a number of different programs that are out there in the UK and in the US, but in the end, I didn't really want to spend time going into the different options, but in the end, I found My Green Lab, and it appealed to me the most. One of the main reasons, it's a not-for-profit organization, and it was started in 2013 by Alison Paradise. She's since moved on last year to other things, and there's a different CEO now. So this is the program that we followed, and some of these slides were given to me by staff in My Green Lab. Rachel Ralph actually gave me some of these slides, like that one and this one. But there are different programs that are run by My Green Lab. So we pursued the My Green Lab certification. There's a green chemistry program. There's a freezer challenge. Then addressing or targeting the supply companies is a thing called the ACT label. So next time you're talking to one of those lab reps that comes to your building, start asking them about this and say, you need to get this. And this label describes the environmental impact of the product that you're purchasing. And I think this is this is going to have a huge impact. And then they also run this other thing more recently called the Center for Energy Efficient Laboratories. But with My Green Lab, and really with any of these lab greening programs, they do share these same actions or the same ideas, and they do have 4 core themes. And usually when people think about lab greening, the first thing they mention is energy. And it seems to be the most common place to start. But the big themes are energy, chemicals, water, and waste. And you might already know that labs, depending on how they're set up and depending on how old the equipment is in the labs, they can consume even up to 10 times more energy than other parts of the same campus if you're on a university campus. So it's really important to pay attention to that. And why? Because of these banks of freezers, because of the fume hoods. So, you know, we can't stop using these freezers, but we do have to think about how we can improve our use of the freezers and fume hoods. So they are the huge energy draw, in particular the air vac systems. So it's really the motors that are managed by the the campus-wide people, you know, who manage the energy or the electrical supply and who run these big fans to take the air out of the labs. You know, that's a huge draw. Water, of course, is very important, but I don't think that we think, well, I certainly didn't until I engaged in this process, think about where the water came from or the footprint of carbon footprint of making water. So that's important. With green chemistry, to an extent, because of government regulations, we have been managing our chemistry quite well. In other words, we do have records of what come in and out of the building, but maybe what we're not doing is proactively looking for alternatives that are greener or ways of recycling our solvents. But of course, there's waste also in the form of greenhouse gases. Why? Because of, you know, extracting the raw materials that are needed to produce the product. If it's an electrical item that's plugged in, and then any greenhouse gases that are generated when you dump the thing at the end of life, if it ends up in landfill or whatever. So getting back to the Green Lab certification process, if you go online, you're going to see that this is the kind of approach that's used. That you start with a baseline self-assessment to gauge your current lab sustainability practices. And now these are the 14 categories that are used by My Green Lab to assess what you're doing. It doesn't mean that you use necessarily every single one of them, but you probably would be using 10 or 12. But you might not be an environmental science lab that's going out and taking samples from rivers and things like that. So let's say field work might not be applicable to you. But these are the kind of questions that you would answer online under these different categories, okay? So it's actually really straightforward. And when we first did that in March 2019, at that time, these were the categories that were listed, and these were our scores. So basically, you answer questions, they trigger the score, and then you get an average score under each of these categories, as you can see them listed here, all right? So that was March, and then we worked with My Green Lab over the next 6 to 8 months, and we you know, formed that green team. And the way we approached it, in fact, was we just made these, like, I just took the questions and turned them into tasks, if you like. And that seemed to work. So I had kind of a task list for each of those categories. And then one person in the team took responsibility for either answering those questions or gathering some information about it, and agreed to do it by a certain time. I mean, it took a while for us to get to this. Like, it didn't, you know, because we hadn't done it before, it took us a while to sort of settle on this approach. But I'm sure that you know, you could make much nicer tables and things like that. Another thing, a waste reduction. So these are just examples of task sheets that we drew up and then divided amongst the different team members to pursue. And then you know, things like this, turning off your equipment, going around the lab and figuring out what can be turned off now, you know, when it's not in use, what can be turned off at the end of the day, what can't be turned off. And we can share these templates with you if you want to print them out. We've since learned actually that you have to be careful with what you print them on, because sometimes the labels start to come off. But yeah, I'm happy to send you an editable version of this if you want to produce these stickers, absolutely no problem. And then look, I mean, you can see that this is a homemade sign. I mean, we literally printed it out, but we did look at different options for this, you know, what kind of sign should be on a fume hood. Printed it out, so one of the people in the team took responsibility for that, and she printed it out, she got it laminated, and she stuck it onto the fume hoods. You know, it does have kind of an impact, but I think we need a bit more. We need more information that's there at eye level for people to see what the impact is if you lower a fume sash. So then when we assessed, after doing all of those things, and we were assessed again, our score went up to over 81%, and we were very, very happy with that, of course. And that meant we got kind of a green banding. I didn't explain the different banding, but it goes, if you get 40%, you get a bronze certificate. If you get 50, it's silver. If you get gold, if you get 60, it's gold. If you get 70, it's platinum. But the very top score is actually green. So I thought that was a really nice idea that they have there with that. And I think some of you might have seen this little movie that we made to document what we did. And maybe that's how people have found us. So we actually prepared it for our annual science festival, which was in November, and we were able to film Alison when she came over to look at the lab. And she did that because it was the first lab in Europe that My Green Lab had certified. So we decided we had to make quite a lot of publicity about it so that it would encourage other people to engage in the process. And there have been ripple effects, you know, the message has been getting out to people and at national and international levels. Nationally, what's happened is that I was invited to chair this public sector lab working group, and the members of this group now have grown, because we were the first university to join, but now University College Cork, Dublin City University, Limerick Institute of Technology, Galway Mayo Institute of Technology, and this is, I think that's Cork, and then University of Limerick. But otherwise, you know, the health service executives, so the hospital labs are in there, the marine labs, state labs, and you know, so it's quite extensive, and it covers the lab activities across Ireland. And because of that network now, we hope in April about to launch an Irish Green Labs website. So maybe there could be a Spanish Green Labs website. And the idea there is that it would be a platform where everyone would share their actions, you know, and put up all sorts of information that people in the labs need to know, because everyone is asking the same questions once they start thinking about this. And if we can just share them and between us all kind of gather the information and share it about our own particular locations, I think it would be very helpful. So that's kind of the aim of this website that's under development. And honestly, I couldn't have predicted that I'd be talking to you 18 months or 2 years ago. So it's been really, really interesting for me, and I've been very happy to do it. But one of the things also that came from this experience is that, you know, this problem, if you like, or this lack of knowledge around the environment in general, amongst in particular life scientists who would never have the opportunity to learn anything, and also the fact that, you know, I kind of might have made it sound kind of easy to do the lab readings, set up the team and everything, but, you know, there was some pushback. You know, there are people, here's someone in the lab and they're pushing back against this kind of lab greening. And I was just wondering, why was this happening? Was it because people didn't really understand what the impact is of what they do in the lab every day? Or was it because of their attitude to global warming? Did they believe in it? I mean, I think there aren't too many people now these days who don't believe that global warming is happening. Or, you know, they might say, well, you know, what can I do anyway, sort of thing. So we were experiencing those kind of attitudes. And when Greta was interviewed by Trevor Noah in the US, that time when she went to the UN, you know, when there was a conference at the end of 2019, and he was interviewing her, and it was the same kind of question that he was asking her. He was saying, well, what can we do as individuals? I mean, this is such a huge problem, you know? And her answer then was, well, the first step is to become informed, which is a great answer. And so, aligning with that idea, we decided to develop a graduate module on Green Lab principles and practice. And in that module, we do a kind of a climate change 101, sort of light touch introduction to topics like atmosphere and climate change, sustainability metrics, the Sustainable Development Goals, biodiversity, ecosystems. Then we touch on the psychology of climate change, sociology, climate change communication, environmental ethics, leadership and governance, biodiversity, as I mentioned already, plastics, a huge topic, and then towards the end we talk about the circular economy. And then, you know, what I just described there about lab greening, and then ideas on how to implement it specifically. And I'm going to mention a little bit more the aspects of psychology and communication, and well, we covered lab plastics already, but one of the issues as I experienced was, you know, if I had picked up any plastic item in the lab, I could not have told you what kind of plastic was in there, mainly because I didn't even know how to name the different kinds of plastic, you know, because I hadn't learned about them. So I wonder, like, could any of you name the actual polymer that is used to make any of these lab items? Maybe some of you can. But certainly I couldn't when I started out in this process. So I thought, well, how can people know what to do with the stuff if they don't know what it is, you know? And you may be aware of, particularly the chemists amongst you, might already be aware of the American Society for Testing and Materials. And these are the people that introduced the resin codes way back in, I think it was it's only about 20 years ago anyway. And these have recently been updated actually, because they used to have these chasing arrows, and they have updated it because people were misinterpreting the chasing arrows to indicate that it was, these things were recyclable when they aren't, you know. So they've now made them into these solid triangles. And we've got 7 categories of resins, going from polyethylene terephthalate or PET, and then high density polyethylene, polyvinyl chloride, low density polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, and other resins. So the next time you're in lab, pick up a piece of plastic first of all and see, does this even have a triangle on it? And it should. You know, this is the thing, we need to put pressure on people to put them on. You might have to go to the catalogue to discover which resin code it is. And, you know, you can't really tell even from looking at it, but you can guess, you know, when it's rigid plastics, but different resins will actually generate rigid plastics. So it's not that straightforward to know what you're dealing with at all, you know. And this is the old-fashioned slide before I put on the updated chasing arrows. So now it should be like this. This is an awful slide, I need to improve it. But the point here, though, with this slide is, see on the tissue culture flask, there are 3 kinds of plastic on here. And let's say we were able to decontaminate it and have it recycled or reused or whatever. We'd have to separate these. Like if you put this into waste with 3 plastics in it, it's not going to get recycled. You've polystyrene in the main body, and then you have a mixture of 2 plastics in the cap. This one, which I think is ridiculous, has got 2 plastics in it when it's in the main body polypropylene, and in the lid, it's high density polyethylene. You can buy tubes that have the same plastic in the main body and the lid. And then our Eppendorf tubes are made of polypropylene. So that's one reason we developed the module. But the other thing that we decided to cover was the psychology of climate change and climate action, because really that's at the root of whether or not people even engage in the whole thing. You know, there's a psychology involved in how people are feeling when you talk to them about climate change. There's a psychology involved in how people behave in response to what you say to them, you know. And it's really, really quite difficult to manage. And I think it is worth learning a little bit about that. And I could give a whole other hour just on this topic, because we do cover it. But the things that you probably have heard already, when I know that you have a committee, so you're all kind of on board already, but when you go into the lab and talk to people who aren't engaged, you know, we get a mixture of responses. Some people are very relieved that there's somebody who's taking action and leading the thing. So they say they're really, really pleased, and they've been very upset about all the plastic they've been using for decades. But then you'll have others who'll say, well, you know, I'm already working on cancer or Alzheimer's or whatever, and I actually don't have time for this. Or who's going to pay for this glassware if I decide to, you know, if you want me to switch to that, who's going to pay for it? How much is it going to cost? What difference in the end is lab really, really going to make? You know, I'm just one person in one lab in a small country in Europe. This is not going to have an impact. Or, well, this is the protocol I've been using for the last 2 years. I'm not going to switch anything in it. You know, and those are the things that you've probably encountered already. And the challenge is then how to shift the balance from all of these things that pile up and make people not do something to having people have their own, changing their intrapsychic. So in other words, what they think, and if they change their thinking, they might change their actions, if you see what I mean. And I put dragons here, and you're probably wondering what that is, but I'm going to explain that now. And this is a concept that was developed by a psychologist called Professor Robert Gifford. He's in Canada. And in 2015, this article was published in New Scientist. It's like a nicely illustrated explanation for what he has defined as 33 different dragons, and he calls them dragons because they're a drag on action. So it's not like the nice dragons that you have in kind of Asian cultures, but it's more the opposite, the more kind of scary dragons. And he's defined 33 dragons that are in 7 fearsome families, as he calls them. But I still think it's really interesting because it demonstrates how complex it is when you start to engage people about the climate at all, you know, from whatever perspective. Limited cognition, ideologies, social comparison, sunk costs. This is the, you know, how much it's going to cost bit. Discredence, perceived risk, and then limited behavior. So these are the 7 families into which these dragons are separated, and he keeps adding them, you know, so he's been working on this for, I don't know, 10 or 20 years. So it's really well developed, and I find it really, really interesting and useful. So for us as a community now of people who are trying to influence others, really, our peers and also senior people, how do we, when we really don't have the background and we're not psychologists, how do we promote pro-environmental behavior? And it means, though, that I think you do have to practice your story, and communication skills are very, very important. And one person who is an expert on this globally is a person called George Marshall, who's based in the UK, and he was one of the founders of that climate outreach organization. And I really like him, and he's, I should have put up a picture of the book, but look him up because he's written this book, which is Why We're Wired to Ignore Climate Change. I can't remember the full title of it. Don't even think about it. I think that's what it is. Why humans are wired to ignore climate change. But he's excellent on advising what has to happen if you actually want to influence people you're talking to. And he says that the framing the impact narrative is key. How do you frame it? How are you going to express the need to reduce plastics in labs? How are you going to talk to your peer who hasn't been doing anything yet? He says that common values need to be identified. What are they? What are the common values amongst your community in Barcelona? People's emotions have to be engaged before they'll do anything. And try and figure out what works for you or doesn't. Another thing he talks about is expressing the problem in terms of your local environment. This is really, really important. So somehow talk to the lab workers, but then talk about Barcelona, talk about Spain. Do you know what I mean? So it's complicated and it's hard. And if it might make things a bit easier if you manage to think about these things. Here's a link to a short video, which I recommend that you listen to, and he kind of summarizes it all there in that video, so I do recommend that you listen to it. So basically the point is that it's challenging, it's hard. You've got different kinds of labs, you've got different practices in the different labs, different pressures on the different individuals in the different labs. So they're all going to be either ready or not ready to engage with the conversation, depending on whether they have a grant deadline or, you know what I mean, they're looking for another job or they're trying to hang on by a thread, you know. So, and it'll be influenced by even their peers when they go back home, or what their family thinks or what their neighbors think. You know, those all play into this. And then ignorance about individual responsibilities is huge within the lab community. The cost is an issue, the cost of replacing plastic with glass, which can be done definitely for certain things. And then, as you mentioned, Max, at the start, procurement and purchasing is huge as well. So really, really big part of the whole thing. So how you can play your part, I think, as individuals. So even, I know that you as a group already are looking at what you're doing. So you've already started this. But if you were to talk, what I try to do with other people in the lab, I say, well, how about thinking about your protocols? Can you pick anything? Just look at one of them and see if you can change any part of it. Can anything be made more environmentally friendly, whether it's glassware or changing a chemical that you're using? Go and set up a green team in your lab. You've done that already, and maybe pursue Green Lab certification or something similar that might be available in your country. But I think a key thing is having the senior people involved, and maybe you have that already. And I think with that conference, that you mentioned earlier on, I think that's really, really useful to have something like that. And the fact that you've made some kind of a pledge already is fantastic. But there are going to be the people who are about to retire who aren't interested, or the postdocs who are like stressed out of their minds because they can't get the result they need to get their paper, or, you know, stuff like that. And then the kind of overworked lab techs who have everyone running to them for various different problems. But they are absolutely critical because they are the ones that are in the lab all the time and they have the knowledge about how things are run. They aren't the students or the postdocs that rotate in and out of labs. So those people are absolutely critical, especially I found for the chemical information and management of waste and things like that. The sustainability officer, again, I think you already know about that, but it's important to have them aware of what you're doing. The building managers, those people have information you might need if you do pursue the Green Lab certification process. So I would say, I think it's brilliant that you have your committee already and that you're meeting monthly. I think that's fantastic. But you know, it's going to be a bumpy road, and try not to be discouraged is what I would say. And in order to meet the challenges, you know, educate yourself. I think that engaging in something like the Green Labs module or other educational resources is a stepping stone to general climate action. It does engage you with that whole community and maybe makes you take other actions outside the lab as well. So if you don't have this available to you, there is the My Green Lab Ambassador Program. I don't know if any of you have done that. It's free. You register, you watch so many hours of videos, you answer some questions, and then you can say, well, actually, and then you get a digital badge and you are you're a Green Lab Ambassador. So I think that's quite doable for people. And the main thing is to figure out what your dream green lab is, you know, for yourself, and then go for it, and then try to influence your peers that are surrounding you in the lab. So I think you're already on the road because of what you told me before the talk started, and I really encourage you to keep going. You will definitely have an impact, and I think the more people talk about this, the more people will be engaged, and I think you will have an impact. So in summary, I mentioned my journey to you here today. I went quickly through the Green Lab certification process and how we manage that. Mentioned the challenges of people's attitudes and different practices in different labs. Went into a little bit of detail about the psychology of climate change and how important climate change communication skills are. And then guidance on how you can play your part. I think you know already, but maybe it's how to communicate that to other people. So to finish, I want to acknowledge we have one sustainability officer in our university, and she's only been in the post about a year. We need a lot more people like that. This is our registrar, so it's sort of number 2 in the university, who set up our community university sustainability partnership group. This is the chair of the group. And then Ian and Katrina and Gesha contribute to the Green Labs module. They help to deliver the content, which is great. Sinead Niwanin, I know that you would never know how to pronounce that, but clearly when you have an M and an H together, it's a W sound. And then that accent on the E turns the E into an A sound. So it's Sinead Niwanin, which is basically Janet Mannion in English. And she manages waste in Connacht and Ulster, 2 of the provinces in Ireland. And we are collaborating with her on our plastics reduction project.